I would like to proceed further. So when it comes to postmodernism as a condition, which we'll be seeing more elaborately, more in a little more detail with Lyotard, who called it for the first time postmodern condition. So, and we are also a sociologist trying to understand postmodernity as a condition of which we are a part, a condition that influences society. This postmodernism bred its own kind of theoretical model called post-structuralism. So if postmodern is a condition, post-structuralism is a theoretical elaboration of that condition, or a theory that succinctly fits itself into the very logic of postmodern condition. Sometimes it's very difficult to say whether post-structuralism produced postmodernity or postmodernism produced post-structuralism. Because if one takes post-structuralism as an approach, then one can argue that post-structuralist approach is what resulted in the emergence of postmodern way of seeing the world. But if one were to see it as a theory or a methodology, then one has to look at it in the reverse direction. Yes, postmodern condition produced the possibility of a new way of sociologizing, a new way of theorizing. That's called post-structuralist theory. And sociologists cannot lay any singular claim on post-structuralism, because post-structuralism influences other disciplines, other ways of producing knowledge, like literary knowledge or even political science, international relations. All of them are influenced by post-structuralist theories, and post-structuralist theories themselves have come from different disciplinary orientation. Their parental discipline is not exactly sociology all the time, like in the case of Foucault, who was more of social philosopher, or people like Derrida, who was more of a literary critique. Okay, yes, somebody is wanting to say something. Okay, so post-structuralism, what is it trying to say? So postmodernism is all about the rejection of universal truth, which in a modernist sense, in a structuralist sense, was trying to understand everything through the binary opposites. We all know that all the disciplines, classical disciplines, which were organized in terms of a structural functional logic or pure structuralistic logic, was trying to understand things in terms of its binary opposites. Even within the linguistic studies also, everything was understood in terms of binary opposites. The meaning of a particular word was the opposite of all that it is not referring to. So that's how people like Saussure would have argued. And similarly, post-structuralism is a theory that is trying to decenter, acknowledge, yes, decentering of human as the primary signifier needs to be challenged. The human is not the primary signifier of things, rather he becomes the signified. He himself is a part of a signification process, and he is as much signified as the different constructs that he or she is using. And the structuralism was very much like sociology was also influenced largely by structuralist logic of binary logic, which was also believing in the centering of human beings. And the centering of human beings is constantly and perennially associated with language. So when a human being is endowed with the possibility of having all the naturally endowed senses, like reason as well as five senses, to comprehend reality, that comprehension needs to be articulated in the form of language. So, and modernism strongly believed a clearly objectified, reified knowledge, language can represent what that individual is comprehending. In other words, if I were to simply say, for example, when you are very hungry, or when you are really fond of someone, and how do you express that fondness to that person? You express that fondness through words and actions. So if the person is not around you, you express it in the form of a word. So you believe that your language has faithfully produced the inner meanings, inner feelings that you have in the form of language. But it is always the case that if you tell the same word with the same intensity to 10 people, and it is still puzzling us why these 10 people have understood it differently, what I told in such a faithful way, thinking that I've got the best language with me. So the representational character of knowledge, language, I'm correcting. So the representational character of language is something that went unquestioned in modernity. If you have the right scientific language, that's what we've been all trained to write our theses in, then you are actually representing reality. What you are seeing is what you are reporting. If language is reporting of what you saw with your senses, then if that language is a perfect language, then we all believed there is no transmission loss between what I'm seeing and what I'm reporting. So this is what is the representational power or ethnographic representationalism in anthropology or sociological representationalism in our social sciences. And we still firmly believe that I can write what I think and feel. But when we are already questioning the thinking and feeling individual as an autonomous individual who is no longer there, then the possibility of that individual feeling and thinking and signifying the same through the use of a language is also questioned. So post-structuralism questions the possibility of a representational language. Language can at best be interpretive in nature, more poetic in nature, symbolic in nature, rather than representation. If you really recall the column, postmodern modern differences, where I've already mentioned cognitive and symbolic. A cognizing subject which can only symbolize that expression. In fact, if you really recall, or if you really remember what people like Thomas Kuhn talked about science, and he said, like, scientists have always used what literary people have used, all metaphors and similes. Science have used more similes and metaphors than probably, or as much similes and metaphors as language people. The word force, the word motion, the word mass, all these things were metaphorical words, never meaning the same. So even science has been accused of using literary devices like similes, metaphors, and whatnot. So in that context, language cannot be taken as a faithful signifier of that signifying individual. So naturally, when you can never objectify your thinking, you never objectify what you comprehend and apprehend in reality in such a non-contesting way, then the possibility of objectivity is also destroyed. So the objectivity is not possible in science, objectivity is not possible in sociology. You can never produce an objective knowledge because knowledge cannot be objective, because there is no objectively perceiving human being. There is no person called objective human being, so there is no objectivity knowledge. And there is no transcendental knowledge, which are free from politics and power. All the knowledge that we have, even if I've used the best of the scientific tools, can never ever be characterized as something that has freed itself from the biases. There is no unbiased, pure knowledge or wisdom. All the knowledges that we produced are guided and governed and interspersed with politics and power and greediness and whatnot. So the whole violence, the whole dirtiness, ugliness of human interest or the social interests constantly interweave themselves into so-called pure knowledge. So there is no pure knowledge, and because there is no pure knowledge, the meanings only are possible, and these meanings are never the structural property of language. The meanings, as structuralists argued, the meanings are the product of association between one word and the other. They always believe that we make the meanings of a thing not in terms of its external factors. For example, we read a book, the meaning of the book doesn't come from the author. The meaning of the book doesn't come from the gender of the author, the ethnicity of the author, or even the book seller. You don't really look at Oxford or that Sage, and the meaning won't change because it's an Oxford or a Sage publication. That's what we believed. They won't change the meaning. They are irrespective of the publisher, irrespective of the individual who publishes it, irrespective of the gender. So we always believed that where does the meaning come from? The meaning comes from the internal logic of the words, internal logic of the categories that the author has chosen to use. That's how we always understood books. But today we understand an article that comes in a particular pirated, predatory journal is different from an article that comes in a peer-reviewed journal. The very fact that a particular journal is peer-reviewed can change the meaning of the article that we are reading, or the gender of a person can change the meaning of a particular joke or a particular text that we read. So now meanings are always the relations, the product of the relationship between intertextual factors, the text of the individual, the text of the culture, the text of the identity of individual, and the knowledge practices that are glorified and popularized within the institutional settings. This is what produces knowledge rather than the pure objective association between one word and the other, or one syntax and the other. So this is not possible. And since there is no objective knowledge possible, it is also the case that there is no emancipatory knowledge possible. If someone says, or even Marxists or any thinker who says that I am producing a knowledge which is more objective, more close to truth, and because of which it will liberate you, then it will be the most violent and powerful knowledge that it can produce. Even though I do understand Marxism, I'm actually sometimes a friend of Marxism, but still, postmodernist logic would say that any knowledge that claims emancipatory character to itself can also be a violent knowledge. If you want an example, I'll tell you colonialism. What was the white man's burden? The white man's burden in colonialism was all the white men. Probably they were well-meaning people. Many of them thought poor Western, Eastern civilizations like Indian civilization, African civilization, they are all poor people. They do not have science. They do not have technology. They are living in such a horrible world, and I need to do something about it. He had a wonderful golden heart when he wanted to come with colonization. Colonialism as a form of knowledge, which thought that it is going to emancipate the African and Asian civilizations from their superstition, was probably for a white man a beautiful emancipatory project. But the same emancipatory project is a violence for all the people who were under the tutelage of colonialism. Colonialism was very oppressive, even though that the colonialist always believed that he was doing the wonderful thing. And all the knowledges which are trying to say that I'm going to relieve you, emancipate you, are the knowledges that have always done most violence. They say that even when someone, even our own parents and children, because the Western colonialism treated itself as a parent and treated all the Eastern civilization as a child, and it wanted us to become an adult. So when our parents also say that, or when some strangers say, I'm like a parent to you, Foucault and postmodernists say, be aware of it, be alert, because there is the beginning of a project of domination, because using this logic of emancipation, people colonize and control and dominate. So postmodernism says no knowledge is emancipatory. Knowledges are nothing but multitudinal way of interpretations, multitudinal way of seeing things, and nobody can ever claim objectivity to it. So it is in this context that we are going to understand these three thinkers. And all of them, all these three thinking in one way or the other reflect some of the salient observations I've made about post-structuralism. And the strands of each of these ideas in full or in part could be seen in all these three thinkers. For example, let us start with Derrida. In fact, as I told, it is impossible nowadays to think of a knowledge as objective and emancipatory. Knowledge cannot make sense without the culture in which the knowledge is produced. The cultural context matters. Similarly, if you really want to understand Derrida, it is very important to understand his culture, understand his biography, his background, the cultural milieu that he was part of. Very interestingly, Derrida was a Jew. So he lived in France, but he is an Algerian Jew who migrated from Algeria and to France, and he lived in France facing a constant oppression from the anti-Semitic French society of his times. Even though he was such a powerful thinker, intellectual, and he was born in a reasonably resourceful family, he was very brilliant student in his class, but he was always marginalized. He was a victim of what was the absolute truths that many people believed at that particular point in time in. So many people believed being a Jew is absolutely wrong or absolutely demeaning, where being a non-Jew Aryan is absolutely a fantastic thing. So the absoluteness of knowledge was the reason why he suffered a lot. And every time he encountered people with absolute knowledge, he encountered more suffering. In fact, he went back to Algeria. Again, in Algeria, he experienced discrimination in the hands of the Algerian Arabs, who also treated him like a Jew, and the white men, colonizing white men, white French men, who also treated him as a secondary citizen. So because of what? Because of the firm belief in the purity of certain races. So absoluteness always bothered him. And he believed that if only everyone had been a bit confused, as I was just trying to respond to Sri Lakshmi's question, if people had been confused about the truths that they were holding on to, that they were ambiguous about it, probably the world would have been a better place. And people like him, and many people would have been definitely better. When the husband thinks he's absolutely right, that is the point at which the nightmare for the kids and the wife begins, or vice versa. So the absoluteness is the problem here, because they would not relent and they would want to impose it on themselves because they think they are scientific, they are logical, so they are right, they are dominant. So this is what really made him. And he was constantly triggered by these encounters with the absolutes, that something must be done to deconstruct them. We need to really find a way to deconstruct so that this absoluteness can be, somebody might tell, look, all these things are wrong. And that's why he believed in the idea of deconstruction. So his deconstruction is both methodology as well as a biographical response to the crises that he faced from time to time. And I'm going to really hang the concept, the understanding of ideas of Derrida on these three concepts: deconstructionism, aporia, and logocentrism. So, because he believed that truth is essentially, in fact, it is not only he proposed the idea that let us all be ambiguous and confused about the truths that we are holding, as a charity, as an attitude of choice, as if no, he said, like, it may be absolutely possible, but let us not even believe in absoluteness of it. It is not even proposing, let us not believe in the absoluteness and let us be ambiguous about it, as if there is a fundamentally absolute truth in it. But he said, no, I'm not even just asking for a change in the attitude towards truth, but also in the very understanding of the truth itself. That truth itself is not absolute. And it is not that I'm asking you to have an attitude of non-absoluteness, but truth itself is not absolute. In fact, the truth is perennially chaotic, perennially violent, and contradictory. What we call as truth is nothing but the triumph of one chaotic vision over other chaotic vision. Because of the power logic, which we will be seeing in the Foucault's thing, because of the power, truth has been established. The one chaotic vision has been established over other chaotic visions. But only when you unlayer them, only when you unpeel them off, you will see that all these visions are chaotic in nature and contradictory in nature. But because of the power, one has become the dominant vision over it. So we need to use deconstruction with a primary premise that all knowledges, all truths are essentially chaotic, violent, and contradictory. And we need to
It's 6
dismantle
o'clock.
our obsession for truth, because we are all the time obsessed with the truth. As I told in the previous questioning session, everyone thinks being confused is ugly and being certain and clear is wonderful. But actually speaking, in a certain sense, all the people who have caused enormous amount of problem, the one who went to wars, the one who dropped bombs, and one who killed someone, were all absolute. They believed in the clarity of what they were doing, and versus the confused nature of it. So we have been trained to become obsessed with truth in modern times. Maybe traditional societies did not allow us to do that. Traditional societies always allowed different Bibles, different biblical interpretations, different Ramayanas, different Mahabharatas. People believed in different ways of being males, different ways of being females. A male could cry in one society, in another society he doesn't have to cry. So, but we all become so obsessed with that singular truth, and that dismantling must be happening. And this obsession with truth has also privileged in modern times the privileging of speech over writing. Again, speech is clearly embedded in language. So the power of language, if you discover that absolute pure language, an objective language, then you can speak objective truth, because you are already perceiving the objective truth. You only need a language to articulate it. Then the speech becomes an important act over writing. Why speech is very important? Because writing is more of a frozen form of speech, and writing was not, that is always secondary. The very Greek, Aristotelian, Plato's logic of didactic lecturing, where they constantly talked and discussed, and the logics were produced better by talking than by writing, was the reason why speech is always privileged. And More than action, the speech was produced. So the speech produced its own writing. So modernity gave more importance to speech and then its subsequent outcome called writing. So speech was believed to be again founded on the understanding that an individual is existing, autonomous, he perceives the truth, and that perceiving, cognizing individual can speak, and that speech can be trusted. Only that the language must be objective in nature. And scientists were trusted over non-scientists in COVID times. We all believe scientists are better people because we believe they have the scientific knowledge in with all this experimentation. And we can their knowledge is more than the knowledge of a rural folk medicine woman. Okay, so the same prioritization of speech over writing also prioritized meaning over truth. The meaning was always a kaleidoscopic meaning. When you see reality, you see different meanings constantly being produced. When you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't see science there, you see a meaning there. Because if you go by science, then we will be seeing a uniformed individual and we will not be regarding ourselves as beautiful people, and because scientifically we may not be looking beautiful in terms of all the parameters of a beautiful person scientifically. So meanings are always constantly changing, and our reality can only be comprehended in terms of the kaleidoscopic meaning that it produces rather than truth, which is actually a frozen nature of that meaning. So if you are meaning freezing one meaning over the other because you have the power and authority, then that is what truth is all about. So truth is nothing but the domination of one meaning over the other, but we need to really unpack the meaning. And that's where he deliberately introduces the concept of difference. So what is difference here? Difference is basically a celebration of plurality. Difference is not exactly difference because difference is the reason why we have got all the problems. Difference in terms of binary opposites. Right was always opposed to wrong, and death was always opposed to life, and black was always opposed to white, and first was always opposed to last. But actually speaking, they are not opposites. They are not different from one another. They are only difference. There is only difference. In other words, death was always part of life, and love is always part of hatred, and hatred and love are not inseparable. Or for that matter, first is not the opposite of last. Anything could be. Or even I used to ask the question in the class, what is the opposite of sit? And everybody would say stand. I mean, look at the way we've been conditioned to think that stand is the opposite of sit. It's a nonsense because the opposite of sit can be run, the opposite of sit can be sleep, and they are all not opposites, they are just part of the difference. So the plurality is what we need to celebrate, but modernity has somehow always told being lost is the opposite of worst and being lost is ugly. And again, as I told, being confused is the opposite of being clear, and being confused is ugly. But difference is actually trying to uh, challenge this notion by asking for discovery of the falseness of many of these things. So, what has been presented as truth is actually not truths, but they are all falses, and they are these falses have paraded themselves, appeared themselves as truths. And modernity is all about privileging certain types of false as truths, and we need to go beyond this obsession with truths. So we have to really anticipate the possibility of encountering falses rather than constantly striving to see the truths. And that's where the violence and the disorganization starts for him. So in this context, he says like move away from the opposites, because in the process of oppositionalizing, of creating opposites, what you've created is violence and domination and hierarchies. So we need to see the merit, value, and beauty of the lesser, the other binaries, the lesser truths, the truths that have always been marginalized, the truths that have been buried beneath the seamless, ordered nature of truth. For example, the notion of human. We always thought we're very certain about the notion of human. There is no two opinion about what it means to be human here. Human means you are supposed to be rational. Human means you are supposed to be honest and kind, whatnot. But only when you deconstruct the notion of human, you realize the violence that this human has done to the nature. You realize the violence that the human has done to himself and herself. In the name of being human, how much violence we have done to ourselves, and how this notion is so contradictory. So only when we begin to unearth the false, We see the beauty of the buried humans, the beauty of inclusiveness we see. The humanness is actually privileging humans over animals. But now we are talking about let us include every flora and fauna as part of our vision. So sociology, what is the task of sociology? Sociology should take upon itself the task of encountering the counterparts of that binary, the counterparts of the truth. We are only going after truths, and in the whole process of running after truths, so many counterparts of truth we are killing, so many counterparts of truth we are burying, or we are not even, we are already walking on the graveyards of the buried counterparts of truth because we are only obsessed with our truth. In fact, the moment we write our research proposal, we start with a problem. In fact, somebody even asked the question, why research is always about a problem? Why not we do a research on on a positive thing, on a wonderful thing in a campus? Instead of doing research on why students do not study, why don't we do a research on how people build wonderful relationship in campuses, or how people do very well in studies? Our study is always about a problem because we always think by negating positives, we can see the truth here. So he says, like, the sociologist task, the research, in a way, if you really want to look at the research should be more oriented towards understanding these counterparts and then privileging them, and then we will be able to see a better world. And this is what he calls it as the aporia, the world of the state of puzzlement. It says like being puzzled is being a wonderful attitude of mind. Being puzzled is wonderful. Being confused is wonderful. One has to be very proud of visiting the state of puzzlement. The one has to be proud of one's puzzlement and has to constantly visit that state of puzzlement because, as I told, puzzlement has committed less violence on society than certainty. And his whole task is the deconstruction is basically an exercise in glamorizing that confusion, glamorizing that puzzlement. Yes, let us be puzzled at the plurality of falses rather than the certainty of a singular truth. Because the truth is essentially messy. Truth is full of messyfulness. It's full of mess. And we have somehow, for our own convenience, we have chosen certain truths because it suits our power relationship. So we need to understand that the truth is always messy. Truth is full of violence. Truth is full of contradiction and ugliness. You remove the veil of truth and you see worms moving around, full of contradictions and the rotten falses you would be able to see the moment you remove the veil of truth. And truth, he says, like, is unfortunately, if you only deconstruct, you realize that the truth is a very confused candidate. The truth is a very confused entity. Only then you can actually sympathize with truth. That, as I told, the moment you really deconstruct the notion of human, you can really sympathize with the human who has committed so much of violence on himself. Because when we say human, this human has always privileged a masculine way of being human than feminine way of human. And we know how men or all the masculinized women have suffered because they have really believed in the particular idea of being human, which is actually a masculinized way of being human. How men, in the process of wanting to look men, never cried and suffered, never became vulnerable and soft, that they died earlier than women, or they died, or they probably started suffering earlier in terms of physical firmity than any other persons in the world. So only when you really deconstruct, you realize the very idea of truths are full of confusions and they really require our sympathy. Puzzlement doesn't require our sympathy, that requires our glamorization, that requires our celebration. Whereas truths, if you really deconstruct it, you can realize the pitifulness of the truth, the confusion of the truth, the messiness of the truth, the weakness of the truth. And it is full of logical defects only when you deconstruct it. So our life journey, our disciplinary goals, our research goals cannot be a journey towards certainty, the certainty of a solution, clear-cut answers. Rather, they must be towards unpacking of the falses and ensuring that the world is a plural place, the multitudinality of the world. Often, if one wants an example, one would say, for example, every morning when you open a newspaper, you would read a scientific article which will say, don't drink coffee because it's going to cause heart attack. And 3 days later, you read another article which says, don't drink tea because you're going to be having heart attack, because our scientific research says that. If you're really looking on a day-to-day basis, a clear-cut answer, you're going to be suffering a lot because you would not drink anything at the end of the day. So, what is a wonderful world? A wonderful world where each of these scientists are saying, "Oh, it is only a conjecture. It is one of our beautiful interpretation of drinking coffee. Maybe there are other possible interpretations. So, don't really take this as a clear-cut answer and organize your life. If these scientists have told this to an individual, yes, we may not know the consequences of it. Imagine these scientists have told the same to Hitler. The scientists have told the same to the fellow who was dropping the bomb. Maybe we would have had a better world. So the possibility of conjectures and celebration of that conjecture is more important. That's what Paul, uh, 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 that I forget the name of the person, uh, the one who written Conjectures and Refutation. Okay, I'll get the name later. So this Karl Popper, yeah, the one who has written the book Conjectures and Refutation. He proposes a research which is more in search of seeking conjectures rather than refuting and then coming out with a complete kind of a seamless knowledge. So craving for neat and good solution, Derrida would say, is the reason why we have all the problems. In fact, actually speaking, when you are really looking for plurality, it is not a question of simplicity. It is not a question of simply. It's actually a sign of maturity. Only seeking one single answer for Derrida is a sign of immaturity. It is only a simple-minded person would want one single answer, one absolute answer, whereas a courageous person would always be able to deal with multitudinality of answers. So, dealing and living and celebrating plurality is a sign of maturity rather than seeking one singular truth. It's a very powerful statement because in our lives we always think as scientific researchers seeking that singular truth that everybody believes is exactly a sign of greatness, which is actually a euphemism for domination. So he says, let us all try to get comfortable with the oscillating nature of wisdom. The wisdom is constantly oscillating. And you look at the choice of the word, he is not using the word truth, wisdom. Wisdom is constantly oscillating, and we need to always get comfortable with it and celebrate that. And as I told in the beginning, being confused is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of maturity. So, for that to happen, we have to get out of this logocentric attitude. So, what is logocentrism? Logocentrism is a very naive, over hasty devotion to reason. We are all devoted to reason. When someone says intuitively, we question it. Even though in our own personal lives, we are all constantly guided by all forms of knowledge, all sources of knowledge guide us. But somehow we always believe that everyone else has to be reasonable to us. For example, we often say that when a woman gets angry or irritated, the man always finds it very puzzling because he thinks the day before yesterday she was fine, but today why is he no irritated? The irritability of a woman, a man can never understand it. If only he always seeks that simple-minded universality of response or the singularity and linearity of response. But only a feminine man can understand that the woman never have a linearity of her life. She's always secular in nature. She's non-linear because of the mensuration. The moods can change, and she's always in a circular. Lunar circle is also the circular that governs her life, and she can very well get irritated because menstruation stage is approaching or on the period day. So the men requires a circular logic to understand it, but unfortunately, the masculine logic constantly forces to seek a linear understanding, including women. When they become researchers, they also seek a linear understanding to the reality rather than a multilinear, plural linear understanding to it. So we are all very naively devoted to reason, logic, and clear definition. And clear definition, a clear definition of everything. Because we think our language is the best and natural mode of articulation of that clear definition, that logic, that reason. And that faith we need to question. So, but it is the truth. The truth is that no knowledge is free from its cultural embeddedness. And that's why Derrida would say it is never impossible, it is absolutely impossible that a writer can always ever transfer his or her thought to the reader, and the reader can ever understand the text free from his own historical experiences and cultural background. So we always understand it in terms of the arbitrariness of meaning. When I read a book, I read it in light of my own historical experiences, and there is no absolute reading of a text. And all the meanings are arbitrary and temporary and transitory. And this is the attitude that we need to have towards knowledge and truth. So, in fact, I began Derrida's presentation by saying he is not just asking for changing our attitudes towards the truth which he is not questioning. He is not saying the truth is always with T, capital T, but only the attitudes must change. No, the attitude as well as our perception of truth, the 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 very understanding of truth must change as well. So here comes the challenges. Again, the continuation of that challenge is what Dirotad is